They were expecting water, maybe coffee, maybe nothing at all, but instead they were handed a cold glass bottle with a black liquid inside, unfamiliar in color, unfamiliar in smell, unfamiliar in meaning, and in that small, ordinary moment, something shifted inside their minds because this was not food, not punishment, not control, and not captivity in the form they understood. And the question that quietly formed was not about taste, but about reality itself, about where they were, what kind of place this was, and how a simple drink could feel more confusing than chains, more unsettling than fences, and more disturbing than fear. Because when a prisoner is offered something normal, something casual, something human, the mind begins to lose its reference point for what captivity is supposed to feel like. And that is where the real confusion begins. The moment did not feel important at first because it did not arrive with ceremony or announcement or explanation, but through a simple, ordinary gesture, a glass bottle passed from one hand to another, cold to the touch, dark in color, unfamiliar in shape, and carrying a smell they did not recognize. And yet in that small detail, something profound began to unfold inside their perception. Because nothing about this moment fit the mental image they carried of captivity, and nothing about it aligned with what they had been trained to expect from an enemy system, and nothing about it felt like control, punishment, or dominance, but rather like normal life quietly crossing an invisible boundary. They examined the bottle with caution, not with hunger, not with excitement, but with suspicion, because the human mind in captivity does not first ask whether something is pleasant, but whether it is dangerous, whether it is a test, whether it is manipulation, whether it is part of a larger structure of control. And this hesitation was not about the drink itself, but about the meaning of the act. Because an enemy does not normally offer comfort, and a captor does not normally offer casual normality. And when that happens, the mind begins to search for hidden intention rather than simple explanation. The first taste did not bring joy, and it did not bring pleasure in a way they might have expected, but instead brought confusion because the sweetness felt excessive, the flavor felt artificial, and the experience felt disconnected from the environment they believed they were in, because this was not survival food and not rationed sustenance and not functional nutrition, but a product of leisure, comfort, and abundance. And that contradiction created an internal tension where the mind could not categorize the moment properly because it did not belong to war, and it did not belong to prison, and it did not belong to survival. Around them, the environment remained unchanged. The fences were still there, the barracks were still standing, the uniforms were still worn, and the status of prisoner still existed. But the psychological meaning of that status began to soften, because meaning is not defined only by structures, but by experiences. And when experiences contradict the structure begins to lose its psychological authority. And this small, ordinary act became a quiet fracture in the internal logic of captivity. What unsettled them was not the drink itself, but the realization that captivity could contain moments of normal human life, moments that did not carry humiliation, moments that did not enforce fear, moments that did not reinforce enemy identity. And this realization created a dangerous psychological space. Because when the mind begins to experience contradiction, it begins to lose clarity. And when clarity disappears, certainty follows. And when certainty collapses, identity becomes unstable. They were no longer only prisoners in that moment, and they were not civilians either. And this in-between state created a silent internal confusion, because the human mind depends on clear categories to survive psychologically. And when those categories blur, orientation disappears. And when orientation disappears, meaning begins to dissolve. And this dissolving did not feel dramatic, but quiet, subtle, and slow, like a shift in gravity rather than a visible collapse. This was not a story about a drink, but about perception, because the act itself was small, but the meaning behind it was large because it represented a world that did not behave like the one they had prepared themselves to endure. And when reality does not match expectation, the mind begins to fracture internally because survival psychology is built on anticipation, and anticipation had failed them here. This single moment became the first crack in their mental structure of captivity because it introduced doubt into a system that relied on certainty and ambiguity into a world that depended on clarity and contradiction into a reality that was supposed to be simple. And that contradiction began to reshape how they interpreted everything that followed. Because once the mind accepts that captivity can feel normal, it begins to lose the internal boundary that separates imprisonment from life itself. What they carried away from that first experience was not memory of taste, but memory of confusion, not pleasure, but psychological disorientation, not satisfaction, but the quiet question of where they truly were because the prison had not changed, but their perception of it had. And once perception changes, reality follows. And this marked the beginning of a deeper transformation, where the mind no longer knew how to define its environment, and the environment no longer felt like the prison it was supposed to be. This was the first step into a new psychological space, not created by force, not created by violence, not created by fear, but created by normality, because nothing destabilizes the mind faster than a system that behaves differently than it is supposed to, and nothing erodes psychological structure more effectively than contradiction. And this quiet moment, ordinary in appearance, became the beginning of a long internal process where captivity would no longer be defined by walls and fences, but by confusion, uncertainty, and the slow erosion of meaning. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. After that first bottle, nothing visible changed in the camp itself because the fences still held their shape in the distance. The barracks still framed the horizon. The routine still arrived on time, and the status of prisoner still existed in every small rule of movement. Yet the mind had already taken a step into a new and unstable space. Because once reality delivers an experience that contradicts expectation, the mind cannot return to the older, simpler logic it used to protect itself. And what followed was not a dramatic scene, but a slow accumulation of ordinary moments that carried the same disturbing contradiction, where captivity continued to look like captivity while quietly beginning to feel like something else. Small details started to become psychologically loud, not because they were sudden or sensational, but because the prisoners were now watching the environment differently, with a kind of forced interpretation that replaced pure survival instinct, as if the mind had become a machine built to search for hidden intent in normal gestures. Because the act of receiving something casual and familiar from an enemy did not register as generosity first, but as a signal that demanded explanation. And when explanation does not arrive, the mind fills the gap with suspicion, doubt, and internal questioning. And this is how normality becomes dangerous, because it removes the clarity that fear usually provides. They began to notice that the camp could contain moments that did not carry humiliation, moments that did not reinforce enemy identity, moments that did not feel like domination. And this did not produce comfort so much as disorientation, because comfort in captivity is not simply a pleasant feeling. It is a threat to the psychological structure that helps a prisoner endure, since endurance often depends on a clear narrative of suffering and opposition. And when that narrative weakens, identity weakens with it, and the mind begins to drift into a state where it cannot fully resist and cannot fully accept, because both positions require certainty, and certainty was dissolving. This created a suspended psychological tension, where danger was no longer clearly located in the guard, or the fence, or the command, but in ambiguity itself, because ambiguity forces the mind to stay alert without knowing what it is alert for. And that kind of alertness becomes exhausting over time, since it produces vigilance without direction, attention without purpose, and suspicion without evidence. And slowly the prisoners began to feel a strange fatigue that did not come from physical hardship, but from the constant need to interpret a world that refused to fit into the category of prison as they had understood it. The contradiction spread through their perception of time as well, because when there is no constant shock and no constant brutality, days lose their sharp edges, and the mind stops measuring time in crisis and begins to measure it in routine. And routine is psychologically powerful because it turns captivity into environment, something present like weather rather than something actively happening. And when captivity becomes environment, resistance loses its urgency, not because the prisoner becomes loyal or obedient, but because the emotional engine that fuels resistance depends on contrast, and contrast was fading. What remained was a quiet internal question that followed them through the day, not spoken aloud as a plan, but felt as a pressure inside the mind, because if a prisoner can be offered a taste of normal American life, even in something as small as a sweet drink, then the entire structure of enemy, punishment, and control begins to look less absolute. And that is where the real danger enters, because the mind begins to lose the boundary that separates imprisonment from ordinary existence. And once that boundary blurs, identity starts to soften. And once identity softens, the prisoner no longer knows how to hold on to the older self that arrived in captivity expecting suffering, since the new reality is not confirming that expectation. By the end of this stage, the bottle was no longer important as an object, but as a psychological marker, the first proof that captivity could contain contradictions, and the first sign that the mind might be reshaped not by force, but by normalization, not by violence, but by quiet routine, and not by terror, but by the slow, confusing presence of ordinary life inside a place that was never supposed to feel ordinary at all. As the contradiction continued to settle into their daily existence, the most profound change no longer came from what happened around them, but from what slowly changed inside them, because the mind cannot live for long inside a reality that has no clear meaning without reshaping itself to survive. And this reshaping does not happen through dramatic collapse, but through quiet internal adjustment, where perception changes first, then interpretation, then identity itself. And this process began to unfold in a way that felt almost invisible, because nothing external announced it and nothing visible marked its beginning. They started to feel less like prisoners in the psychological sense they had once understood, but they did not feel free either. And this in-between state created a silent internal tension, because the human mind depends on clear categories to remain stable. And when those categories dissolve, the self loses its anchor. And when the self loses its anchor, identity becomes fluid, uncertain, and fragile. And this fragility did not express itself as fear, but as distance, a growing emotional separation from their own experience, where they were present in their bodies but detached in their minds. Their memories of who they had been before captivity began to feel less solid, not because they were forgotten, but because they no longer felt connected to the person they were becoming. And this created a psychological split between past identity and present existence, where neither fully fit the reality they were living in, and the mind responded to this split not with resistance, but with adaptation. Because adaptation is the brain's way of restoring balance when meaning collapses. And this adaptation did not feel like acceptance, but like numbness a flattening of emotional response that made everything feel less intense, less urgent, and less defined. Routine replaced resistance, not as a conscious decision, but as a psychological shift, because routine offers stability when meaning disappears, and the mind will always choose stability over chaos, even if that stability exists inside captivity. And this is how the prison begins to move inward. Because once routine becomes the primary structure of existence, the external system no longer needs to impose control. As the internal system begins to regulate behavior on its own through habit, repetition, and psychological accommodation. They were no longer mentally preparing for escape, and no longer emotionally preparing for punishment, and no longer psychologically bracing for violence, because the environment no longer triggered those survival patterns. And when survival patterns fade, identity changes with them, because identity is built on response, and response is built on threat. And when threat becomes abstract, the self loses its sharp edges and begins to soften into something undefined. This undefined state became the most destabilizing experience of all, because suffering creates meaning, and meaning creates endurance. But ambiguity creates nothing solid, and without something solid to hold on to, the mind begins to drift, and drifting does not feel like collapse, but like quiet detachment, where the internal world becomes calmer on the surface but emptier underneath. Because emotion loses its intensity and purpose loses its direction. They began to exist in a psychological suspension, where time felt less important, the future felt distant, and the past felt disconnected. And when time loses its structure, identity loses its narrative. And without narrative, the self cannot remain coherent, because coherence depends on story, and story depends on continuity, and continuity had begun to dissolve. This was the stage where captivity stopped being something that happened to them and started becoming something they existed inside, not as prisoners in a struggle, but as individuals inside a system that no longer felt actively hostile and no longer felt actively humane, but simply present. And this presence became the new reality, where the mind no longer fought the environment, but learned to exist within it. And this quiet internal shift marked the deepest transformation so far, because the prison no longer needed to shape behavior, as it had begun to reshape identity itself. By this point, the small moment that started everything had long passed, but its effect continued to grow, because once the mind learns that captivity can feel normal, it begins to lose the internal boundary that defines what captivity is. And when that boundary disappears, the self no longer knows where it ends and the system begins. And that is where identity truly starts to dissolve, not through force, but through adaptation, not through violence, but through normalization, and not through fear, but through the slow erosion of meaning. As their internal world continued to reorganize itself, the environment around them began to lose its psychological importance, because the fences, the guards, the rules, and the visible structures of captivity no longer felt like the true sources of control. And instead, the mind itself had become the primary space where limitation existed. Because once identity shifts, perception follows. And once perception follows, reality changes shape. And this transformation moved captivity from something external into something internal, where the prison no longer needed walls to define it. They no longer measured their existence by physical restriction, but by psychological possibility, by what felt thinkable and what felt unthinkable, by what felt natural and what felt forbidden. And this internal mapping of reality replaced the old physical boundaries of the camp, because the mind had learned to operate within invisible limits. And invisible limits are more powerful than physical ones, because they do not need enforcement, and they do not need supervision, and they do not need punishment. as they exist as internal rules rather than external threats. This is where the idea of freedom itself began to change meaning, because freedom no longer felt like movement or escape or physical distance, but like a mental state that no longer seemed reachable. And when freedom becomes psychological rather than physical, the desire for it weakens. Not because the person becomes obedient, but because the mind no longer knows what freedom would even feel like. And without a clear image of freedom, the emotional drive toward it begins to fade. Their internal world became quieter, not in a peaceful sense, but in a muted one, where emotional reactions softened, urgency disappeared, and intensity flattened, because the mind had adapted to a state of suspended existence, where nothing demanded immediate response and nothing required decisive action. And this emotional neutrality did not feel like safety, but like distance, a distance from themselves, from their former identities, and from the emotional structure that once defined them as soldiers, enemies, and prisoners. The camp itself began to feel less like a place and more like an environment, something present but not psychologically charged like weather or landscape, because when a system becomes normalized, it loses its emotional meaning, and when it loses emotional meaning, it stops generating resistance. And this is how control becomes invisible, not through fear, but through familiarity, not through violence, but through routine, and not through force, but through psychological accommodation. They were no longer waiting for an end in the way they once had, and no longer imagining a future in the way they once did, because the mind had shifted from anticipation to adaptation, and adaptation does not look forward. It stabilizes the present, and this stabilization created a form of internal stillness where existence became repetitive, predictable, and emotionally neutral. And when life becomes emotionally neutral, meaning begins to disappear because meaning depends on contrast, and contrast had faded. This internal stillness became the final structure of captivity because it removed the psychological energy needed for resistance, for escape, for rebellion, and even for hope. And without that energy, the mind does not fight the system, it coexists with it. And coexistence is the deepest form of submission because it does not feel like defeat and it does not feel like obedience, but like normal life. By this stage, the world itself had become the cage, not because it was physically closed, but because it had become psychologically complete, containing everything the mind now recognized as real. And when reality becomes psychologically complete, nothing outside it feels necessary, and nothing beyond it feels urgent, and nothing beyond it feels meaningful. And this is how captivity achieves its deepest form, not by locking the body inside a space, but by shaping the mind to believe that the space is the world. By the time this transformation reached its final stage, resistance no longer felt like something that had been taken away, but like something that had slowly faded on its own, because nothing had crushed it violently and nothing had broken it suddenly. And yet it was no longer present in the mind as a living force, because the psychological conditions that create resistance had disappeared, replaced by routine, familiarity, and internal adaptation. And this adaptation had reshaped the entire emotional structure of their existence. They no longer experienced captivity as an injustice that demanded response, but as a condition that simply existed, a background reality that no longer triggered emotional urgency. And when a human being stops emotionally reacting to confinement, confinement loses its psychological sharpness. And when confinement loses its sharpness, the mind stops defining itself against it. And identity begins to detach from opposition, because opposition requires a clear enemy and a clear struggle, and neither felt real anymore in the way they once had. Hope itself began to change shape, because hope requires a future that feels different from the present, and the present no longer felt unbearable enough to demand a radically different future. And this is where the deepest psychological shift occurs, because when the present becomes tolerable, even inside captivity, the future loses its emotional pull. And without that pull, the mind no longer projects itself forward, but stabilizes where it is. Their internal world became organized around stability rather than change, around routine rather than transformation, and around psychological safety rather than freedom. And this safety did not come from protection, but from predictability, because predictability reduces anxiety even inside restrictive systems. And when anxiety disappears, urgency disappears with it. And when urgency disappears, resistance loses its foundation. The memory of who they had been before captivity began to feel distant, not as a painful loss, but as a fading reference, because the self adapts to the environment it lives in, and over time the environment becomes the primary frame of identity. And when that happens, the old self no longer feels fully real, and the new self does not feel fully chosen, creating a psychological state where identity exists without direction, without intention, and without struggle. This is where captivity completes its deepest function, not by restraining movement, but by reshaping meaning, because a system that can remove the desire to resist is more powerful than one that must enforce obedience. And a system that can normalize limitation is stronger than one that must impose it. And a system that can redefine identity is more enduring than one that can only control behavior. They had not been defeated in a visible way, and they had not been conquered through violence, and they had not been destroyed through suffering, but they had been transformed through adaptation, through normalization, and through psychological accommodation. And this transformation did not leave scars on the body, but marks on perception, not wounds on the skin, but changes in identity, not trauma in memory, but silence in the mind. By the end of this process, captivity no longer needed to assert itself because it had already been internalized. And once something is internalized, it no longer needs enforcement. And this is the quietest and most complete form of control because it does not announce itself, and it does not reveal itself, and it does not feel like domination, but like normal life. And when captivity becomes normal life, resistance does not disappear in a moment. It simply fades into stillness. What stayed after that moment was not the taste, and not the object, and not the experience itself, but the quiet psychological shift it created, because the mind had been forced to adapt to a reality that did not match its expectations. And that adaptation reshaped how captivity itself was understood, turning it from a physical condition into a mental state, where meaning mattered more than walls, and perception mattered more than fences. This was not a story about a drink, but about contradiction, because when a prisoner is offered something normal, something human, something ordinary, the mind loses its reference point for what captivity is supposed to feel like. And once that reference point disappears, identity begins to soften, certainty begins to dissolve, and the old structure of enemy and prisoner slowly loses its psychological power. What began as a simple moment became a deeper transformation, where captivity stopped being defined by force and started being shaped by normalization, where control no longer needed fear to exist, and where resistance no longer had a clear foundation, because the mind had adapted to a world that no longer behaved like a prison. And once the mind adapts, reality follows. And in the end, what remained was not memory of suffering, but memory of confusion, not memory of violence, but memory of contradiction. Because the most powerful changes do not come from trauma, but from quiet moments that slowly reshape how the human mind understands the world it lives in. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.